All right, so last week we talked about what some of the reasons that Haman gave to Xerxes for his request to destroy the Jews. And remember that Mordecai has insulted Haman by not bowing down to him, and we talked a little bit about that last week. And then we moved on to the fact that Haman decides not just to go after Mordecai, but he decides to go after Mordecai's entire people, the Jews. So, what are some other reasons, besides their laws being different from everyone else, and they are not observing the king's laws, that Haman might have cited for why he wanted to destroy the Jews? Historically speaking, what did other nations think of the Jews? All right. Does anybody from last week have the Ezra reading, Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 6? If not, I've got it here. All right, so Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple for Yahweh, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the leaders of the families and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we also worship your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time King Esarhaddon of Assyria brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the other leaders of Israel's families answered them, "You may have no part with us in building a house for our God, since we alone must build it for Yahweh, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." Then the people who were already in the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. They also bribed officials to act against them to frustrate their plans throughout the reign of King Cyrus of Persia until the reign of King Darius of Persia. At the beginning of the reign of Ahasuerus, the people who were already in the land wrote an accusation against the residents of Judah and Jerusalem. And then if we skip down to verse 11, this is the text of the letter they sent to him. "To King Artaxerxes from your servants, the men from the region west of the Euphrates River, let it be known to the king that the Jews who came from you have returned to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and evil city, finishing its walls and repairing its foundations. Let it now be known to the king that if that city is rebuilt and its walls are finished, they will not pay tribute, duty, or land tax, and the royal revenue will suffer. Since we have taken an oath of loyalty to the king, and it is not right for us to witness his dishonor, we have sent to inform the king that a search should be made in your father's record books. In these record books you will discover and verify that the city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces. There have been revolts in it since ancient times. That is why this city was destroyed. We advise the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are finished, you will not have any possession west of the Euphrates." Well, that's a pretty strongly worded letter to the king. Is any of that accurate? Yes, I was going to say, yeah, some of it is. It's a mixture of truth and stretching the truth a little bit. But the Jews had a history of rebelling against their various overlords and the peoples that had conquered them over the years. That's why Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon went and destroyed the city in the first place, was because they were on their third rebellion by the time he destroyed them. And that's not counting the other various things that they threw off the yoke, as it talks about in the book of Kings and Chronicles. So there is a history of this city doing exactly what they say in this letter, not paying tribute and throwing off rule, and there have been revolts and rebellions. In fact, that continues all the way through. So what happens after the time of, you've got the Persians, and what's the empire that comes after the Persians? The Greeks, okay? And what do the Jews do under the Greeks? You've got Antiochus Epiphanes, and what happens to Antiochus Epiphanes? That's the Maccabean revolt, right? So the Maccabeans rebel against the Greeks, and the Jews throw off the Greeks for a time until the Romans come in, and the Roman Empire then controls the region of Judea. And what do the Jews do under the Romans? They rebel again, exactly. And so you have Jerusalem destroyed in AD 70 because the Jews rebel against the Romans. So this is a pretty accurate summary of how the Jews tend to treat conquering nations in terms of rebelling against them, and there have been revolts in them since ancient times. That's not an inaccurate assessment, is it? And so these are the kinds of accusations that Haman is leveling also against the Jews as a people here in the land. It's not unknown to Xerxes because it's in the chronicles of it. It says, you can review and you can see what these people are like. So we have this timeline, and what you can see here is that we've got Esther as queen here in this period, Ezra 4, 6 through 23, that we just read from. And then earlier in Ezra, verses 1 through 5, so this is the reign up to Darius, and then this is Xerxes through Artaxerxes. And Esther's right in the middle of this. So this is all taking place concurrently with that first and second return that have happened, where Ezra and Nehemiah are rebuilding the walls, rebuilding the temple, and she is caught up in all of this. So there's a little bit of a wider context to what's going on than just this plot by Haman, right? So when we get to Xerxes, how could Xerxes justify the extermination of the Jews? He's got an entire people that Haman has said, I'm going to wipe them out wholesale. He's going to essentially commit genocide. And Xerxes gives it the okay. Why would he do that? Okay, money. So that's certainly a motivation. Haman offered a lot of money. 10,000 talents of silver is approximately 300 tons. The estimated annual tribute paid to Persia by outside conquered territories was about 15,000 talents. So Haman is almost offering to double what the king is taking in from tribute from surrounding nations for the privilege of destroying the Jews. So money is definitely a motive here. What else?
He did it before to other nations.
What's that?
He's done this before to other nations.
Okay, he's done this before to other nations. He rules over a very ethnically diverse kingdom, and he may not know much about their individual customs. Now, Haman has obviously researched the Jews, and Haman knows what he's doing, but Xerxes might not. All right, what else? What else do we know about Xerxes' behavior as a king? What happened when Vashti said she wouldn't come? Who steps in? Is it Xerxes that immediately makes a decision, or what does he do? Okay, he relies on his advisors. So Haman's trusted. He's number 2 in the kingdom. And he's now saying we've got this group of people that need to be put down. And Xerxes has a history of relying on his advisors for advice. Now, in a way, that's good and bad, right? It's good in that he's willing to listen to external advice and take it to heart. It's bad in that he hasn't necessarily surrounded himself with the kinds of advisors that he ought to be listening to, such as Haman. And as we discussed, the history of the Jews was one of rebellion. The kings want peace. I love one of the things about the Roman Empire is that they had a mandate called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. They didn't care about justice. They just wanted peace. And as every parent knows, sometimes that's true with your children, right? You don't necessarily care who started it, you just want them to be quiet. And that's how the kings felt. They didn't want justice, they wanted peace. All right, and as we said, Haman offered a lot of money. So without questioning Haman any further, the king gives Haman the kind of this blanket authority and right to do as he pleases. So either Xerxes is satisfied that Haman's planned course of action is the right one, or he just simply isn't bothered by how the Jews are handled. This do-as-you-like attitude is kind of dismissive of the gravity of annihilating an entire people. I can't really get into the mindset of this, but again, we have to remember, we're dealing with somebody who's dealing with an unfathomable amount of wealth. 300 tons of silver in tribute, right? So, what does Xerxes do? He gives away his signet ring. He gives away executive power to the Agagite, an enemy of the Jews, And we talked about a couple of weeks ago that this might be a little bit of a personal vendetta. Mordecai being a descendant of Saul, and Haman potentially identifying as an Agagite that may have referred to him as a descendant of King Agag of the Amalekites. Furthermore, regarding the sum of money that Haman mentioned, the king says, "The money is given to you." Now, this could imply acceptance of Haman's financial arrangements or a change of plan, and it's hard to say. Although the NIV translates that as "keep the money," and so that's potentially another way of looking at it. But what is clear is that Xerxes just hands the matter over to Haman and gives him blanket authority, gives him the resources, gives him the people. The irony of the Hebrew text lies in what Haman is literally instructed to deal with the people as it seems good to you. For Haman, destruction is what seems good, but that is in fact evil. All right, so the edict goes out, and in chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. Does somebody have that reading? All right, I don't remember. I think I handed that one out last week also, so I'll go ahead and I've got that here. The royal scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and the order was written exactly as Haman commanded. It was intended for the royal satraps, the governors of each province, and the officials of each ethnic group, and written for each province in its own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the royal signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to each of the royal provinces, telling the officials to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month. A copy of the text, issued as law throughout every province, was distributed to all the peoples so that they may get ready for that day. The couriers left, spurred on by royal command, and the law was issued in the fortress of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink while the city of Susa was in confusion. Now, what's described here is a very involved process. You have multiple scribes in different languages. It was sealed with the king's signet ring, which I believe we've got a seal here. Yeah, there's an Egyptian seal and another seal that's belonged to Shebna, son of Ahab, in the 7th century BC. It was official. There was a kingdom-wide notification, which is not a common event. In spite of the fact that the book of Esther has mentioned 3 times that these couriers have gone out, this really wasn't something that happened terribly frequently. The verses emphasize the totality and all-inclusiveness of the king's remit. It was sent to all the king's provinces. It applies to all the Jews. It says young and old, women and children. It means total massacre. The order is to destroy, kill, and annihilate. Repetition for the sake of understanding what was supposed to happen. Now, does that order sound familiar? What were the Jews supposed to do to the Amalekites? They were to utterly destroy them, not to leave one of them alive. This is an exact reversal of what God had ordered King Saul to do to the Amalekites. They were to not only, and in the case of the Israelites, they weren't to plunder them, were they? What were they supposed to do? Why was Samuel angry? Okay, because they brought the stuff back. He said, "What is the lowing of oxen and the bleating of sheep that I hear?" They plundered the Amalekites instead of destroying what they had, which was what God had ordered. But that's the only difference here. Haman has ordered that they be utterly wiped out. And it's very reminiscent of what Saul had been ordered to do by Samuel. The city of Susa was in confusion. The reference earlier to the citadel of Susa is specifically the upper city. That's, all right, we have the royal city, we have the artisan city, and we have the Susa, the citadel, the palace here, and the Acropolis here. So that royal city area is the upper city located between the Ulai Canal and the Shuar River. The workman's city, which comprised a much larger area to the east, is the area mentioned here. The exact extent can only be estimated since it hasn't been fully excavated. All right. Any questions or comments before we move on to chapter 4? All right. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
One question. So this is I'm curious. So Haman was an Agagite? He was an Agagite? Am I saying that right?
Yes.
I'm not looking at the scripture. I'm just trying to remember. And you mentioned, was it King Agag?
Yes.
Okay, was this a revenge play for Haman?
That's what it seems,
Right?
as far as we can tell.
Yeah, so he was thinking back to those days when they were utterly destroyed, and he said, hey, guess what? Because back in chapter 2, he gets promoted to number 2, right?
That's what the evidence suggests. So we have that Haman is an Agagite, and therefore probably a descendant of King Agag. We have Mordecai, and if we look at his family ancestry, he came from Kish, who was the father of Saul. So he's related to Saul, who was the one ordered originally to destroy the Amalekites and spared King Agag.
Right.
And we have the same order that was given to destroy the Amalekites that is now being given to destroy the Jews. So this very much reads as kind of a revenge play. Here's Mordecai who has insulted Haman, and Haman comes back and says, all right, not only am I going to take down Mordecai, but I know who you are. I remember who you are. So we're going to take out all your people just like you tried to take out all of mine.
Yeah. So here's a little irony for you, basically.
A little bit of irony for you. Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. So, somebody over here. Yes.
I found it interesting that when he issued the edict in verse 12 and 13, that it was on the 13th day of the first month, and then it was to be executed on the 13th day of the 12th month.
Right.
So he gave them 11 months to plan, prepare, and get ready for this to be accomplished. This wasn't like, okay, we're going to go and take care of this next week. It was a very well meticulous plan of his and preparing all of his satraps and leaders to get rid of the Jews.
Yeah, and about that, so last week we looked at that slide, remember when they cast lots to figure out when they were going to do this. And it came up that they were going to have a year, essentially, to prepare for this. And that not only gives Haman's people time to prepare to do this, but it also gives the Jews time to prepare for what's coming. And so we can see God's hand in this and his providence in how things fell out so that the Jews have sufficient time to get ready and essentially to defend themselves, which we'll get to in a little bit, but that's what ends up happening. But you're right. They had nearly a year on the calendar from the time that this happens until the time that the scheduled destruction was going to happen. Anything else? All right, who's got Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 3? Okay, go ahead, Toby.
When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes.
Up until this point in the story, it's been the king and his officials who have been responsible for responding to moments of crisis. We've seen how the king responds to Vashti, we've seen how Haman responds to Mordecai, and now we have the Jews who are responding to the edict that has gone out from the king. So Mordecai, representing the Jewish community of Susa and beyond, takes action, and it prompts the other people to move from kind of a helpless and passive acceptance of the circumstances to a place where they can challenge what's going on. So we have the image here of people wearing sackcloth and ashes. It says he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai's actions reflected Jewish practice and local custom. We can read, who has Genesis 37:4 and 2 Samuel 1:11? Yeah, go ahead and read those for me if you would.
So Genesis 37:4.
It's on. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Don't think that's right.
That might be the wrong verse there.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, well, let's move on to 2 Samuel 1:11, see if that one works better.
This one's a little more pertinent.
All right.
Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him.
Okay, so this why was tearing your clothes a sign of mourning, a sign of anguish among these people? I mean, if I go and I tear a $12 Walmart T-shirt, does anybody care? I have a lot of shirts in my drawer. Did these people possess typically a large wardrobe? No. In fact, we have things in the New Testament like if anyone has 2 tunics, let him share one with someone who doesn't have one. It was not common for people to have a large wardrobe, number of changes of clothes. In fact, we see something like, I'm trying to remember, it was the servant of... I think it was Elisha, wasn't it? Because Elisha was the one that healed Naaman, and his servant goes out and he asks for so much money, and then changes of clothes are one of the things that he asks for. Clothing was a commodity in these days that was not widely. You didn't have very much. So tearing your clothes was a sign of deep anguish, and it was meaningful, and it was destroying something valuable. All right, so tearing the clothes, and then they're dressing in sackcloth and putting ashes on themselves, which again, a symbol of mourning and a symbol of deep spiritual anguish. It was a public sign of mourning and concern. So Mordecai leads all the Jews in this act of public mourning, displaying grief and emotion in ancient times, as in some cultures today. Demonstrating grief in this way was the norm, and therefore does not imply that Mordecai was behaving ostentatiously. However, the wording here emphasizes that Mordecai does nothing to avert attention either. He goes into the city wailing and crying bitterly, and it's repeated twice here, giving the literal sense that he cried out with a great and bitter crying out. However, what happens because Mordecai is dressed in sackcloth? What can he not do? Okay, he can't go see Esther because he can't make it to the king's gate, because nobody wearing sackcloth is allowed in the king's gate. This is an interesting bit of cultural correlation. When the first message came to Susa saying that Xerxes had taken Athens, it gave such delight to the Persians who were left at home that they strewed all the roads with myrtle boughs and burnt incense and gave themselves to sacrificial feasts and jollity. The second, however, coming on the heels of the first, so confounded them that they all tore their tunics and cried and lamented without ceasing, holding Mardonius to blame. That's regarding Mardonius' defeat that we looked at back in the early weeks of our study. And that's from Herodotus. So this kind of the tearing the clothes and the public display of grief and mourning was very common back then. Mordecai's actions are copied by the Jews in every province when they hear the word of the king and his law. So again, we have the couriers. We looked at the Persian mailing system. This went out to everybody, and it would have reached the far corners of the Persian Empire fairly quickly. Profound solemnity is conveyed by the phrase and the synonyms fasting, weeping, and wailing to describe the type of mourning that took place. There's an interesting parallel here. What happens when Jonah goes and proclaims disaster in Nineveh? Okay, that's what they did, right? The Ninevites, first the king says, perhaps what? What's the motivation for the Ninevites? Okay, perhaps the Lord will change his mind. And the specific language is, and relent from this disaster that he has declared. So, in spite of the fact that God isn't mentioned in Esther, what are the Jews clearly doing? Okay, hoping that God will change his mind. So, this type of action, even though God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, we see actions of faith on the part of the Jews. We see actions of faith that are looking to God and his providence for deliverance from this disaster that they know now is coming. All right. Next, we have Esther, who learns of the plot. Who has verses 4 through 9? Chandler.
So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. So Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told all that had happened to him, and that the sum of the money and Haman's had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. And he also gave him a copy of the written decree for the destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go into the king to make a supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther of the words of Mordecai.
Well, this is an interesting group of verses, isn't it? A lot of things let's unpack this a little bit. So there's some interesting implications here. Esther didn't know of the decree. The harem was politically isolated. She hadn't heard about this until who comes and tells her about it? Okay, it says her female servants and the eunuchs. So Hathach obviously knows about the relationship between her and Mordecai because he's sort of this go-between. And she has access to some resources, so she sends clothes out to Mordecai. And what does he do? He turns her down. But what does turning her down mean? Where does Hathach have to go? Okay, back to Esther. But I meant to meet Mordecai. Where does Hathach have to find Mordecai? Mordecai's outside the gate. It says he has to go to the city square that's outside the gate. Mordecai's still not allowed in the king's gate because he's wearing sackcloth. So she summons Hathach, and he's the eunuch in charge. And even though she's limited by her situation, she starts to take action on her own initiative. And this is Esther starting to take command of her situation a little bit here. So how did Mordecai get a copy of the text? He gave her a written copy of it, or he gave Hathach a written copy of it to give back to Esther. Where did Mordecai get it? Okay, it was given out. A copy of the royal decree was posted all over the place. So he's got one, and he worked at the king's gate. And if we look at Esther chapter 2 and verse 22, he's got informants. He's got people who tell him things because he's the one that revealed the plot against King Xerxes in the first place. So, it was published publicly. So Mordecai tells Hathach to do what? Okay, he says, go tell Esther to talk to the king. Well, that leads to an interesting back and forth between Esther and Mordecai. So who has Esther chapter 4, verses 10 through 17? All right, Josh.
Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
All right. So, Esther summons Hathach, orders him to go and reply to Mordecai. Now, you'll remember we had a question a couple of weeks ago regarding Esther's access to the king. And earlier, Esther had access to the king. So, what is Esther's reply here about her access to the king? He hasn't called on her for, it's been a month since she's seen the king. And remember, again, the harem, politically isolated. The only people that she's around are her female servants, the other women in the harem, and the eunuchs. Those are the only people allowed to see her. So she has limited access to the outside world, and it's been 30 days since she's seen the king. Now, what that implies is that earlier, when she did have access to the king, that she was being called to him on a regular basis. So, at this point, she no longer has that. And now, that poses a danger to her. All right? These verses make two things clear. First, she has enough authority to command Hathach to return to Mordecai with another message. And second, her authority in the king's court is no greater than that of any of his other subjects. This is both her predicament and her opportunity. Her words explain her precarious situation to Mordecai. So they related Esther's words to Mordecai. And Mordecai sends back to reply to Esther saying what? Yeah. It says, if this happens, you'll die anyway. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? We often look at our present situation and fear the moment without considering the future. We are prompted to inaction in the present moment by a fear of what could happen later. And what is Mordecai's response? He says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's now or later. If you don't take action, then you'll go down with the rest of us. And he says, for if you remain silent at this time, what? Relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Now that's an interesting statement as well. Again, there's no mention of God here, but this is clearly a statement of faith on Mordecai's part. The Jews will be delivered as a people, and it is up to the individuals to decide how they are going to choose to live their lives. I think there's a strong statement for all of us in that. God's people, as Christians, will be delivered. We are promised that there will always be a remnant. But how we live and how we choose to act matters to us as individuals. That as a people, God's people will be saved, but it's up to us to make sure that we're living the way God wants us to. And who knows whether you have attained royalty for such a time as this. Now, Mordecai's response to Esther has three elements. First, her own life is in danger, right? She's not exempt from this. Number two, the Jews will be saved with or without her. And number three, potentially her very purpose in life is at stake. You might be in the position that you're in so that you can do some good here. What do we know about the power to do good? All right, what do we know about a failure to do good when we know what's right?
That's called sin.
Okay, that's called sin. Go ahead, Brother Dabney.
I don't know anything more powerful than this place where we are in the writing of Esther for us as we go forward day by day. There's mysteries. We don't know what's around the corner. We sort of know our relationship to God, but we don't know the deepness of it that we should. And who knows that there might be something that's going to cross our path that makes a profound difference between me and God or between somebody else and God. And this just ought to ring with us all the time, I think.
And I think about that passage. It says, to him who knows what is right and does not do it, to him it is sin. And I also think about the parables that Jesus taught when he says, of him who has, more will be required. And I look at our nation and the people that are in it, and we who have much, and I wonder what's required of us. And are we taking the opportunities that we find? God doesn't ask us necessarily to go create opportunities. Esther didn't have to go looking for something grand to do. But when the things came to her, when the opportunity presented itself to her, how is she going to respond? How will we respond? Go ahead, Brother Felician.
So, in Matthew 10:16, it says, this is where Jesus is talking about persecutions. And in essence, it's very much like what we see Esther is having to deal with here. Mordecai is helping her to recognize, this is your time to step up. And in the same way, if we have to bring the application to ourselves, we see how Jesus is talking, again, direct application to the apostles, but for us, the idea of be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. So, it's not for us to go necessarily create a revolt for Christ. That's not what this is about.
Right.
This is about, in essence, advancing the glory of God in the abilities that we have. Use those abilities to continue to further the gospel. That's it. Because this is not our home. Our home is not here. We're not preserving anything here.
That's right.
We're preparing for our place to be in heaven with our Father and the Son, for all eternity. Hebrews talks a lot about that.
And that's a great way of applying that principle in our own lives. And I'll get the Whittens here. Next, go ahead, Jim. And then Nizzy.
Ladies first.
Okay. Nizzy and then Jim.
I was just reminded of a very poignant quote during World War II by Dietrich Bonhoeffer that says, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act."
Inaction is itself a form of action. Or if you're a Rush fan, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice.
Hey, Aaron, it's interesting that Mordecai uses fear on one hand. You're going to die anyway, is how we would say it. But then he comes back and he appeals to her loyalty and her faith in God. And so it's interesting, God does the same to us. There is a fear element in, our destruction at the end of our life that we obey for that reason, but then that matures into more of a loyalty and a love and a thank you for what He's done for us as we live our lives. The other thing is when you quote that scripture about to whom much is given, much is expected, oftentimes we just think of that in terms of financial gain because we're Americans and this is the land of capitalism, that kind of thing. But I think God's talking about your talents, not the gold ones, but the intrinsic ones.
Agreed.
Or those that you develop or that He's blessed you with. So your talents, your time. Are you giving of your time? That's the only thing we all have the same amount of, right? 24 hours a day. And then your relationships. Are you leveraging your relationships not for personal gain, but for kingdom gain? And I think that's what Mordecai was doing with Esther. He was saying, look, you've got influence. You've got money. You can give the guy clothes if you want. You are in a position to make this happen. The only question remaining is, will you do so? And that's the question for us as well. We're in a position to make things happen for the kingdom, and the question we all face, and often fail to give the right answer, is, will we do so?
It's interesting that you bring up the material side of things, because Esther clearly has access to material things to give to Mordecai and to her people, but that's not enough, is it? And I'm reminded of the words of Jeremiah. He says, when I tried to, I didn't want to speak the word of God anymore, but I tried to hold it in, and it was like a fire within me until it came out. He had to speak because he understood what the consequences of not speaking were. And I also recall the words of Christ when he says, if it's just a cup of cold water in my name. We don't have to look for the big things. We have to be on the lookout for all the things. Sometimes the opportunities that are presented to us are small or individual, as in the case of the parable of the Good Samaritan. It could be just, as we talked about it last week, somebody that you're helping on the side of the road. All right. One more thing I want to get to before the bell rings. And we have I've got a reading in Psalm 27:14, 37:34, and Proverbs 20:22. Let's just read the first one of those. Psalm 27:14. That's Kyle over here. We may have to pick up here next week, but I'll at least get the question out.
Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. The Hebrew word here is sometimes translated expect. Wait means to serve him by anticipating what he has promised.
Okay, so how do we reconcile this Mordecai's determination for Esther to take action with the idea that we have there in Psalm 27:14, Psalm 37:34, Proverbs 20:22, all of which talk about this idea of waiting on the Lord? Mordecai prompts Esther and says immediate action is required or everything might be lost. These other verses say wait on the Lord. Wait for his salvation. How do we reconcile those two? Since that's the bell, I'm going to leave you with that. Think about it. We'll come back to that.